And with that, I want to say, hey, Parker, man, welcome to the Bitcoin Breakout and Survival Podcast.
Great to be here, Jack. Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad to have you. We had a snafu the last time we tried to set this up quite a while ago, and I was really happy to get another shot at having you on. You're an awesome voice in the world of Bitcoin. But I was wondering if maybe you could start out with just telling people a little bit about your personal background, because you came out of more of the conventional finance asset management side of things, right?
Yeah, correct. I like to think about it as that I was perfectly predisposed to not understand Bitcoin. Had a classical economics degree, schooled in the Keynesian kind of backwards way of thinking, went and worked for a Wall Street investment bank, worked in restructuring, worked in asset management. And in 2016, that's when I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. Had the great privilege of meeting Safety Namus, who wrote a book called The Bitcoin Standard a few years later, and helped me start to understand kind of some fundamental questions about what money is, what makes something a better or worse form of money. And I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and came out the other side an Austrian, or kind of more aligned with the Austrian way of thinking about the world and about economics and all that follows from there.
Yeah, I was saying for my intro on the audio side, I actually think people that understand money really kind of bifurcate into two camps with Bitcoin. If they'll go down that rabbit hole, they perfectly understand Bitcoin once they do. But it seems like it's very hard for them to. It may be because they've had benefit from the existing system. It's hard to see its flaws. But it was Safety, who you mentioned, his second book, I guess it's his second, was the fiat standard. And it seemed like he kind of realized like you had to explain fiat for many people to really get Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think it can go either way, where people go down the what is money rabbit hole and really build up from first principles. And for others, it's helping to see not just the flaws, but the really backwards incentives of the fiat system. And people can get at it from either angle, and having resources like Safe and now his book are super helpful to help see the world in a different way, in a way that honestly makes a lot more sense.
You mentioned the book you read, but what really pulled you out of that space and made you decide like this is what, not only just were you into Bitcoin or you thought maybe there was potential, but it was something you really wanted to be involved with?
So I think timelines are important. When I went down, really before I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, Safe had taken me down the money rabbit hole. And that was around the same time that Safe was starting to become very interested in Bitcoin and started writing. But at that same time, I was working for a hedge fund in Dallas, Texas, and I was going down a separate rabbit hole, which was trying to understand what would happen when the Federal Reserve started to unwind post-financial crisis quantitative easing. The $3.6 trillion that the Fed digitally created between 2009 and 2014. And I was on Wall Street at that time of the financial crisis, but I was very recent out of school and had no context of what was happening around me. And in that 2016 timeframe, while I was also starting to go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, I was independently going down this rabbit hole of what actually happened in the financial crisis. Why did it happen? And that was to help answer questions of when they started to unwind those emergency measures, what I thought would happen. And so independent from Bitcoin, I came to this conclusion that the Fed and central banks all over the world are going to have to print money, digitally created, however you want to describe it, for the rest of time until that system breaks completely or with finality. And I think it was very important that I formed these opinions independent of Bitcoin, that legacy system was broken. And there's a saying, I think, in the finance world where people will say, it was crazy, it's not going to end well, but the Fed had to do it. And there's no logical connection between that was crazy and it's not going to end well, but they had to do it because inaction is always an action. And so because I was anchored to that point of that this is a problem Like it's a problem for all of us. It's a problem for us on an individual level, community level, family level, business level, society level, that there was going to be another path forward. That idea that money doesn't grow on trees and that there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, those are very true statements. And society had been conditioned that maybe those axioms were no longer true, but they are true. And that kind of coinciding with that journey of research and coming to those conclusions, I also started to understand principally what makes something a better or worse form of money, what money is at a fundamental level. And that combination of factors allowed me to see Bitcoin, to understand it. And the more I went down the technical underpinnings of Bitcoin, as well as pairing that with understanding the monetary aspects of it and knowing that our current system was living on borrowed time, I started to really be able to, in a very rational and logical way, kind of get myself consistently back to the point of why Bitcoin probabilistically was going to be adopted as the world's new form of money, and looking at it as a massive problem, but also being able to work on small parts of being the solution, was attractive to me. That kind of combination, being like, hey, like we have to build an ark because this is coming one way or the other, and what is going to be the most likely lifeboat. And that when I started to develop conviction around the two sides of that story, and it's kind of apropos to the title of this podcast, I started to see in a very logical way, not in a hope and a prayer way, that Bitcoin was going to be the world reserve currency. And it made a lot of sense to work on that rather than working at a hedge fund.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the modern money system being broken? Because I think if you walked up to, did man on the street kind of interview thing where you got to talk to people and ask them, is the monetary system broken? They would say yes. I don't think they would actually be talking about the monetary system, though. They would mean, well, I'm not paid enough, or my house costs too much, which are symptoms of the problem. But I don't think most people even understand how money is created, what velocity of money is, what the M3 is, like the Cantillon effect. They don't understand any of these things. When they say this, they just know that they're unhappy, and they know that they don't have as much money as they would like to have.
I think that is one of the, I think that is absolutely right. And I think it's one of the most complex problems of explaining Bitcoin to people, because many viewers of your podcast, many people that are friends of mine, are actively conscious of the fact that between 2009 and 2014 that the Federal Reserve created 3.6 trillion new dollars. And then probably more people are conscious of the fact that between 2020 and 2022, the Federal Reserve created another $5 trillion in base money. Most people have no idea what base money means. Most people have no idea what M1 is, what M2 is, what M3 is. But the reality is 99% of people have no idea that the Fed created all that money or what the consequences are. Even those people who understand that they created this amount of money might not be able to explain, well, why, if the Federal Reserve over the last 13 years increased the money supply by 10x, why hasn't everything fallen apart? And it is because very few people, one, understand that that's happening. Two, even fewer people would understand the consequence. But all of it comes out in the things that cost money around you, the things that you need to sustain yourself, the gas at the gasoline station, the food at the grocery store, very basic necessities, energy, your power costs, your power bills. They feel that. And one of the problems with this is that they feel all the symptoms and they're looking around for explanations, but because they aren't familiar with the monetary system, or they have, a lot of other things to deal with in their daily lives, they don't have that, oftentimes, that opportunity to sit down and spend 100 hours or 500 hours, like really getting to the bottom of it. And that is a reality. That is a reality of what we're up against. But at the same time, the way that I explain it to those people is that they know that their government's printing money, right? They've heard, they have that general idea. Now, while they don't necessarily know how it ties in, the way that I try to simplify it for people is, imagine each individual day that people work, 8 hours in a day, 40 hours in a week, give or take hours for individual people. What are the consequences of your money being guaranteed to purchase less value that you put in? Because then when I try to visualize it for people, I say, now, like, imagine a simple chart with an X and Y axis, and imagine every day from that point in time when you delivered value to somebody else, that your value delivered degrades into the future. Now, imagine the consequences of that society-wide, that when people, what it functionally represents is that you don't actually have an incentive to create value to other people around you, because it's guaranteed to purchase less in the future. And what do people start to do in that world? They start to game systems. They start to make money rather than deliver value. And those are two very different things. And their time preference increases because they're literally running on a hamster wheel, and they're on a finite clock. They know from that point in time, because the price signals, and the price signals are the food at the grocery store continues to get more expensive. My dollars lose value. I've been conditioned that. I know that happens. Now, how do I respond to those very broken economic incentives? Because when I talk about the system being broken, it is that if you are delivering value to other human beings, to people around you, producing real goods and services, that value should be retained into the future, not just in an optimal world, but in a world in which you could even have some semblance of economics incentives being aligned. If all value I delivered to you was guaranteed to purchase me less in the future, what is the actual underlying incentive to deliver value? If you flip that script, if you take the fly out of the ointment, which is, I produce value for you, and that's going to retain its value, if not purchase more value into the future, I'm more incentivized to do that. Because the Fed prints money, they engineer your world to, as you deliver value, it basically gets pulled out from underneath your feet, and people feel that every day. That is the dollar purchasing less. That is the gallon of gas, $4 a gallon versus 75 cents. It is the ribeye costing $20 rather than $5. That happens as a function of time. But when people start to think about the points in time when they deliver value versus when they consume value, it's a very perverse set of economic incentives. And when I say broken, I mean at the end of the day, that what will happen to the US dollar or the euro or the yen is what happened to the Venezuelan bolivar. At some point in time, that value goes to zero because they print money at a cost of zero, and it really isn't a sustainable situation at all. And it can persist as a function of time, but it can't terminally.
Man, there's so much in that. I mean, go to zero because the cost is zero. As any technology app will show you that. Like, what did you pay for, the clock app on your iPhone? Absolutely nothing, because there's no cost of production. Another thing that you said about people have to take like 100 hours to even understand the monetary system, I think that's kind of a trap. I don't remember who said this, but somebody said of the way that money is created in fractional reserve, that the process is so simple that the mind is repelled by it. And I've seen, and I'm talking smart people here back in my days in corporate America and all, where these discussions would come up, having drinks after hours or something. And you would explain how when somebody gets a mortgage, the bank doesn't give the money. Their promise of money creates money. And you'd see serious cognitive dissonance. And again, I'm not talking about dumb people here. I'm talking about people that run, large companies and things like that. They just never even thought about it. And it's almost like, well, that it's not that it's hard to understand. It's that the mind says this can't be true. Banks are also printing money. No, the government prints money. Well, actually, the Federal Reserve prints money in concert with the government, and then the banks print more money. And so this creates this velocity of money through the economy. And I guess it can take hours and hours for somebody to understand that, but I think it's more because it's very difficult to accept. It's not so much it's difficult to comprehend.
I think I would say it's both, right?
Okay.
Like, I think what you described is absolutely true. That when you explain the reality, it sounds so ridiculous that the default assumption is that you don't know what you're talking about.
They would have told me that in school, right? I mean,
yeah. And I go back to like, kind of one iteration before the bank issuing a loan and creating money via that mechanism, and I think there is some cognitive dissonance in it, where I'm like, from 2020 to 2022, the Federal Reserve created $5 trillion new dollars. And that the way that happens is that functionally a click of a button on a computer screen happens. That when I talk about it costing zero to produce $1, it costs zero to produce $1, it costs zero to produce $1 trillion, it costs zero to produce $5 trillion. That is why its price will trend to zero, because it costs nothing. And not just that it costs nothing, but that they persistently print trillions of dollars. And truthfully, the number trillion is too large of a number for any of us to actually conceive of in our daily lives of what it means. But that is the reality of what they're doing. And that when people say like that can't be true, it absolutely is true. And that if you look to the current president of the Fed or Ben Bernanke before it, like they say this out loud, like don't trust us, like take it straight from the horse's mouth. Neil Kashkari, the Minnesota Fed president, had a famous comment on 60 Minutes where he said we have an unlimited amount of cash, but also Ben Bernanke and Jerome Powell have described the actual process by which they can just click a button on a computer screen and credit more money into banks' accounts. That is the operation of how the $5 trillion gets created. Button in New York gets clicked, and you producing value and getting paid dollars happens in a very different operation. So I think that is difficult for people to grasp or accept, just because they're like, can't be true. When I'm talking about the 100 hours, it's like, why? It's more so like asking the question about like, why did the dollar exist in the first place? At an atomic level, what is money? A lot of times people will say it's a collective hallucination or a belief system. I reject those. It is objective. And that to really understand the objectivity of money, even though it might be esoteric and there might be some intangible properties of it, that it is objective. And that rabbit hole is something that I think a lot of people are daunted to undertake. They might worry that if I go down this rabbit hole, I'm not going to understand it. But even that one, I feel like it's more of a common sense evaluation than it is an IQ, because people know how to evaluate A versus B and the properties that exist in one economic good versus another.
And their cost of production is good, but the cost is zero, but the cost is not zero. That's the other thing. I think that people need to make the connection then, that when they take the zero cost of production of new money, the value has to come somewhere, and all value is derived from the economy in which the money circulates. So when Parker has $10,000 in his bank account because he's worked really hard and saved some money, and I print new money and I devalue the existing money by, let's say, 2%, that 2% comes out of Parker's $10,000 and everybody else's money. And that's what you were talking about. Your unit of production is devalued across time, and infinitely so across a long enough period of time. Because even though it doesn't cost them anything to make that money, the value of it must come from somewhere, and it comes from the energy, it comes from the goods and services, it comes from the value exchange between individuals, companies, et cetera, in the economy. And that's a difficult thing to comprehend as well for people. It seems that's a hard thing to explain.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I think when I try to tie it back to that time, if I save $10,000, thinking about the actual number of hours that I put in the past, that I can never get back. And that when the Fed, via its operations, produces money at a production cost of zero, they're introducing more money into the system, which devalues all of it. I am bearing the cost of that.
Correct.
I am bearing the cost of that in the present and in the future. So there absolutely is an economic cost. It's just not borne by necessarily those that produce it.
Agreed. So let's talk a little bit then how does Bitcoin as a monetary instrument, a monetary good, differ from the fiat monetary system?
So I would say, and I do think it's the greatest of contrasts, and I try to simplify it down to a few kind of A/B test type items, and that kind of at its most fundamental level, dollars are infinite. because the Fed can produce them. But it's not just the Fed; it's central banks all over the world. And if dollars are infinite, that Bitcoin, and I always, whenever I sit down and explain Bitcoin to somebody, I always say there's one thing that I ask people to take away. It is that all fundamental value in Bitcoin derives from the fact that there will only ever be 21 million. And that if Bitcoin can credibly enforce a fixed supply of 21 million, which I have a high degree of confidence in, not based on prayer and hope, but based on my own understanding of how Bitcoin works, why it works, what money is, what money isn't, that if Bitcoin credibly enforces a fixed supply of 21 million, which my view is inevitable, it will definitionally emerge as the global reserve currency. And the reason for that, but if I'm comparing and contrasting the legacy system, it is a currency with a finite and fixed supply versus a currency, the dollar system or the euro, the yen, that is functionally infinite, that becomes more and more abundant as a function of time. That is the most important contrast, because what Bitcoin represents is simply a form of money that can't be printed. And what that means is, if I'm contributing my time, my 8 hours in the day or 12 hours in the day today and tomorrow and the next day, and I'm being paid in a form of money and it's Bitcoin, I know that somebody can't come behind me and produce more of that. It is not as simple as that, because the how that happens is Bitcoin's true 0 to 1 innovation. It is not trivial, and that when I think an important thing that I like to bring up for people is there's 1,000 cryptocurrencies, and I like to be clear with this because it's hard for people to grasp this. Some people will say 95% of everything else is probably junk, just like venture capital investing. I say no, 100% of it is. That there is a reality that we all gravitate and converge on one form of money because it's solving a problem of trade. Like Jack, you and I have to agree on what the form of money is in order for me to pay you. I had to have the form of money, and you had to be willing to accept the form of money. We objectively evaluated all forms of money in the market in order to be able to form a consensus. But that problem that exists between you and I exists between the third person that comes into our arrangement of trade and potential trading partners. That same problem extends out to all 7 to 8 billion people in the world. And so when I'm comparing and contrasting, I do think it's important to draw that distinction, because when I'm comparing the Bitcoin system to the dollar system, it is finite supply. That is why it's fundamentally valuable. To how that happens is Bitcoin's true innovation. But it is solving that specific problem of governments and central banks and banks printing trillions of dollars. But we only need one solution, because inherent in the problem of what money solves is this problem of trade and exchange. And that is something that is intersubjective between the two of us. But then when I extend it further, I would say that not only does the Fed and banks, however you want to think about it, create money out of thin air, they do it arbitrarily. So Bitcoin not only has a fixed supply, but it is not issued arbitrarily. It is issued based on proof of work, based on the security apparatus that is in place to actually protect and enforce that fixed supply. On the one hand, the Fed has presidents and chairmen and 12 group of people who get to decide how that money is arbitrarily issued, when it's issued, who it's issued to, how much it's issued. Bitcoin does not work that way. It has a fixed supply. No one is in control of it. Bitcoin doesn't have a CEO. There's no group of people that get together that decide that the supply is going to remain fixed. The supply is enforced by the entire network of people who've adopted Bitcoin as a monetary standard, and that it's not just some sort of piece of software that governs and dictates that Bitcoin will only ever have a fixed supply of 21 million. It is the network incentives as a whole, and that's everybody running software, everybody using Bitcoin, everyone completing payments in Bitcoin, everyone running a Bitcoin node, validating rules, all the miners in the world that are spread out in every geographically dispersed location. And that only happens because Bitcoin's decentralized. That's another way that the Bitcoin system is different than the legacy system. Bitcoin is decentralized. The legacy system is centralized. It wouldn't be possible in a decentralized system for 12 people to get around a table and decide to print $5 trillion. You can't do that in Bitcoin, but the only reason why you can't do that is because it is decentralized. No one is in control versus a very few number of people being in control of the legacy system.
Agreed. And I think that part of that is the true market discovery of price is based on cost of production. So what I mean is if half the Bitcoin miners quit tomorrow, Bitcoin would keep going and we would probably have some pretty slow blocks for a week until the difficulty adjustment came down, but that would happen. Or if the number doubled tomorrow, the difficulty adjustment would go up, but we would still remain at the same emission schedule across time. We know how much Bitcoin there will ever be, but we also know like how much Bitcoin there will be this year. It's
Right.
I've equated it to like economists should love Bitcoin because Bitcoin is the speed of light to money as this is to money as the speed of light is to physics. It's the constant. It's the only economic constant that we really have, which means you actually can be predictable in it. But then market can truly discover price because if it really did cost, like there might be people losing a little bit of money mining Bitcoin right now because they're speculating. Most of them are still profitable because they're getting the cheapest energy they can. You will only produce a unit at a loss without a government subsidy for so long before you'll stop producing it. So it's going to be that the value of Bitcoin will adjust relative to production across time, and it has to. And it took me a long time to get there. That's what finally pushed me to the last bit of being a maxi. I was like a 95% Bitcoin guy, and then I was like a 99% Bitcoin guy. But when I truly understood that mechanism, and you threw the Lightning Network on top of it that solved all these other issues that people were bringing up, was like, it's going to be the one thing. But it's really just a form of Gresham's law. Because I'll even have people now like, Jack, I want to pay you for a membership in some shit coin. And I'm like, all right, but I just want you to know you're depositing it to an exchange account and I want Bitcoin. And so I'm still getting Bitcoin in the end. And that's like a microcosm of what you just described. That's one person making that journey. And what you're describing is over time, the majority of people making that journey.
Right. And that as a function of time, more people, the way I describe how Bitcoin gets adopted is that it's not actually knowledge distribution, that people have to form, just as you explained, like 95%, 99%, then, you were there 100%, that everybody has their own individual journey, but everybody needs this economic good called money. And that what we call money is doing one thing for everybody simultaneously, which is storing value into the future. Or another way to describe it would be intermediating a series of exchanges. I earn money today, and then I'm going to spend some of it in a day, in a week, however long I'm going to save it, a month, a year, but I'm spending at those points in time. And the value that it's delivering is storing value in time. And so if you get paid in some shitcoin, or whether it's the dollar or some cryptocurrency A through Z or 1,000, you're making the decision A versus B. Which these two things are designed to do the same thing. Which one is going to do it better? And if you need that thing to trade in the future, it is intersubjective in the sense of you're objectively evaluating it, but so too is everybody else in the market. And your decision is based on, what am I going to accept? What is the guy who sells beef going to accept? What is the rancher, the guys at the Beef Initiative? They look at the same equation. If you want their cow, their proof of work, if you want their barrel of oil, you got to pay them in a form of money that they're willing to accept. And there is that convergence because we're evaluating it based on it performing the exact same function for all of us, which is different than all of our individual consumer preferences, which vary, versus storing value in time. And then the other thing I would just mention is what you were talking about in terms of, kind of the idea of block production and the sequencing of it, of like miners cut in half. One of the ways that I help people understand that is thinking about, and it is different, but there are similarities. It's like when the price of oil comes down, a bunch of people producing oil who are above the marginal cost have to shut down, and then the market finds a new equilibrium. Now, money serves a very different function than energy, but it's very similar in that regard. If the price comes down and certain miners can't be profitable, they will functionally turn off, and then that benefits and constantly calls the herd and drives the greatest efficiency in the network, which is to seek out and search out the cheapest cost of power. And that goes on consistently because of the economic incentives of the network as a whole.
Yeah. And the difference, of course, being when the price of oil goes up, people drill harder, pump harder, and make more oil. When the price of Bitcoin goes up, more and more people seek it, but you don't get more Bitcoin.
That's the critical difference, the inelasticity.
And that goes right into where I want to go next with gold and silver. I have a lot of, I guess you would call the sons of Peter Schiff in my audience, right? The gold, and they love the gold. And I don't hate precious metals. I have some holdings in precious metals. I just think it makes lousy money. And much as if the price of oil goes way up, they will produce more oil. If the price of gold goes up, gold miners will produce more gold. And that's part of the issue. But I don't hate on that group of people. I often look at them. It's going to sound a little weird, but you mentioned ranchers. I often look at them kind of the way I look at vegans in regard to meat. When they correctly identify the problem with things like CAFOs, they perfectly identify that we're producing these animals in a horrible way. We're shoving them into these CAFOs. We're feeding them grain. They're not supposed to eat that. But the solution then would be, well, then we should be eating beef that is grass-fed, not we shouldn't eat beef. And I feel like a lot of the modern gold and silver advocates, they've identified the problem with the monetary system very well, but they've chosen an instrument that's not good today as money. It can't move at the speed of light. It's not programmable. There is no way to self-custody it and have that flexibility with it. And so what are your thoughts on the variance between Bitcoin as money and gold and silver as money?
100% agree with you in that idea that I think that proponents of gold and silver and commodity monies have appropriately and perfectly identified the problem and the symptoms of the problem, and then get the solution wrong. And I think that is also very logical. I equate it in many ways to myself, where coming from the legacy financial system, trained classically in Keynesian economics, schooled in the way of a certain way of thought to reject Bitcoin, that kind of having been so right about the problems, but not coming to the right answer is a really hard thing to reverse on. So that's one thing I would say, that it's kind of when you're so right about the problem, it's difficult to de-anchor yourself from having been wrong about what the solution to that problem might be. Now, I also try to relate it to my own experience, because I think my own experience is symptomatic of what people who are proponents of, say, going back on a gold standard have to accept, or at least have to question, which is that when I started going down the what is money rabbit hole, at that point in time, I was someone who would have said gold is a barbaric relic. That, would say, hey, if I ever wanted gold, I'd rather have, cows and guns. Like, it's a shiny rock that can't do anything. Then I went down the rabbit hole of what is money, and started to understand why gold emerged as money over thousands of years. That was critical to my being able to understand Bitcoin as money. I just happened to be looking at gold with a fresh set of eyes at the same time that I was also understanding Bitcoin, rather than being anchored in time to it. But just stating that understanding why gold was money was critical to my own understanding of why Bitcoin was money. And what I started to develop a framework around was that when you get to the core of why gold emerged as money, that there were an inherent set of properties that existed in gold that were unique to gold when you added them up, that made gold the best form of possible money that could have ever existed. The same properties that caused gold to emerge as money, I would put forward, exist in Bitcoin, but not only exist in Bitcoin, have been perfected in Bitcoin. And that it's not marginal, that it's orders of magnitude, that it exists in a different plane. And I think one of the things, and I'm very sympathetic to it, but one of the things that I put forward in a very respectful way to people who've saved in gold for a long time are a few things. One of which is this anchoring to the physicality of gold, and what I had to develop in my own framework was, there were thousands of things that were physical. There were many different forms of commodities. It actually had to be something other than its physicality that caused gold to emerge as the preferred form of money. That it was actually the physical nature of it was not the thing that was unique about it. It was the fungibility of gold, the indestructibility of it, the ability to melt it down and divide it and coin it, and that those coins would, kind of whatever was in one coin versus the other, that was perfectly pure. That the physicality of it was the last thing that made it the preferred choice. The other thing that I point to people is that if they start at a more fundamental level, and when I'm explaining Bitcoin to people, I actually use gold. I say, you have to accept that gold emerged as money. You might not be able to explain why that happened, and you might not need to in order to understand Bitcoin, but you have to accept that it happened, that the entire world converged on one monetary standard. Now, that doesn't mean that individuals couldn't make a wrong choice, or that countries couldn't even make a wrong choice. Certain countries went on the silver standard and had their wealth expropriated. They made a bad choice, but that the world did converge on one form of money as a monetary standard. And the key question is why, and was that by coincidence? It wasn't by coincidence that gold emerged as money, nor is it by coincidence that Bitcoin is emerging as money. And that if people accept that the world converges on one form of money for reasons very fundamental to the problem that money solves, that just as people evaluated gold versus silver and chose gold, people are evaluating gold versus Bitcoin. And the more that go down that fundamental rabbit hole of storing value into time and the objective properties that exist between Bitcoin and gold, more people end up saying, I would rather store my value in Bitcoin. And the way that I compare it, like heads up, because that, just as I'm evaluating Bitcoin versus dollar, I'm also evaluating Bitcoin versus gold. And if the world converges to one form of money, the same way that it existed in the past to converge on gold, the same will be true of Bitcoin. And then the relevant questions come in, and the way I think about it is, yes, gold is relatively scarce, but Bitcoin is finitely scarce.
Mm-hmm.
Gold is able to be divided and aggregated in parts that are fungible, but that is difficult to do. It's difficult to assay gold. It's very easy, effortless to divide up Bitcoin, aggregate Bitcoin, and assay Bitcoin. And then gold was actually susceptible to centralization because those properties existed in gold but were difficult. Gold needed to be stored in a physical location and then assayed at that physical location, coined in a certain way, so that you could develop trust that if you were getting a gold coin, that it was actually gold. But there was a lot of risk embedded in that, even those properties existed. Those problems are solved in Bitcoin. So when you combine finite scarcity with the ability to easily divide and aggregate with this mic drop capability of Bitcoin, which is you can take that physical property of scarcity and transmit it over a communication channel, that's the mic drop. And that when you compare A versus B, gold versus Bitcoin, of what properties actually make something more or less functional as a form of money, that the consensus actually is important because money is solving a problem of trade. And that the more people that do that, it doesn't matter how anchored you are to gold, it matters what the consensus of money is. And with each new person that picks up that equation or that problem and looks at gold vis-a-vis Bitcoin, whether they're doing it consciously or subconsciously, if it's subconsciously, it's like which one's preserving value over time. If it's consciously, they're doing that objective evaluation, that they will arrive at that conclusion of Bitcoin over gold on those very fundamental properties of money. And that it's not one of those scenarios where you can just sit in the corner and cover your eyes, because what everybody else decides is consequential to you because they are your future trading partners. They are the people who will be providing goods and services and say, pay me in Bitcoin versus pay me in some other form of money.
Yeah. And let's be fair. Let's say you and I were born 40 years earlier and we were at where we are in our walk in life now, and it was 40 years ago, and we were having this conversation, I don't know, on the telephone with somebody holding up pictures for somebody else in a room to watch, something like that, or like over television or something. You and I might be sitting here right now making a really strong case for gold, because 40 years ago, we didn't have this option. Nobody had conceived of this option. And so
right, we would have been right, because
how do you make an 8 look like a 10? Put 1 8 in a room full of 4s, right? And then all of a sudden the 8 looks like a 10. And then when the 10 walks in, you can see the difference. And nobody needs to take that and being nasty about anything. It's just a reality check. Like, what looks like perfect may not be perfect until you actually see perfect.
Right. And what I would put forward is that is what makes it difficult, because like, oh, well, gold's an 8 and Bitcoin's a 10. I'm good if I, just have this 8. But in reality, and again, not in a
not once the 10's here.
Not in a disrespectful way, but anchored to this principle that if you accept that there was some rhyme or reason why the world converged on gold, the one thing, then, and that is not a hallucination, that it was for very rational reasons, even if everyone who was adopting it didn't necessarily understand this consciously, that if the world converged on one and it happened for very tangible, objective reasons, then that's going to guide what happens next, that the world is going to converge to one. And if it is 8 and it is 10, and 10 is clearly better than 8, then the world converges on 10.
Because everybody can have 10. That's the big difference. It's that since everybody can have the 10, then why would you take the 8? And again, don't get too subjective and barroom mind thought with that, people. Think of what 10 would mean to you in the total package in all things. Then you would definitely take the 10 over the 8, and everybody would. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. Because
their decision is dependent on what everybody else is going to accept as a form of money. Because what it actually translates to is somebody in the future delivering gas to the gas station and saying, pay me in X, food to the grocery store and pay me in X. That it's not just storing value, but then being able to convert that value in time in the future. And that is why when I say it's an intersubjective problem, that we're all objectively evaluating the 8 versus the 10, the A versus the B, but our decision is informed by what that next person is going to value in the future, what their objective evaluation of what a better form of money is. Because if I don't have it at that point in time, I'm SOL.
Yeah, and so let's talk about the 21 million supply limit and how it's enforced, because that's really important. Because one way we can look at Bitcoin is energy storage with a zero cost to store. Once there might be a fee to transfer it, but once I have it, it doesn't cost me anything to store my Bitcoin. It costs me in security and weight and space to secure gold. It definitely costs me in fiat just through inflation. And if fiat, or if this was how I got paid every week, and it was a certain amount of energy was shoved into here, like a battery, and when I went to pay for something, I transferred a little bit of energy to the other side of it, kind of like with Bitcoin. Inflation is that this battery gets drained by a certain percentage over time, across time, forever. And then the Bitcoin choice, what makes it better is it doesn't get drained. If I have 5.35 Bitcoin, I have 5.35 Bitcoin forever. There's never a piece of it that bleeds off. There's no emission that comes out of it. But that's all predicated on the fact that no one can just make more Bitcoin. And I think people often say, but since it's backed by nothing, which is total nonsense, but I can understand why somebody feels that way. They don't, I think, understand or believe, maybe is the right word, that this 21 million hard cap is truly a 21 million hard cap.
Yeah, in one way, because when I'm explaining Bitcoin, I like to focus on the why. It's like the why and the how. Because first people have to understand why a fixed supply of 21 million that you could transmit over the internet is of value to the world, functionally every human being in the world, because Bitcoin is permissionless and it's censorship resistant. Anyone that, there are some requirements. You have to have a connection to the internet to be able to access it, or a mesh network and others, but functionally speaking, for most people, the internet. You have to understand why that would be of value to the world, because that unit of currency is the thing of value worth protecting, worth securing, worth ensuring. So you might hear the term Bitcoin mining and not understand what exactly that is. You might hear the word a node and and validation, but you don't necessarily know exactly what that is. But first, the why. We would all benefit people can easily say, hey, if there existed this form of money that couldn't be printed, would that be of value to the world? Most people with common sense would say yes.
Sure.
If I could be paid in a form of money, A, that can't be printed, my alternative is B, one that is either mined at 2% incrementally a year or printed by the trillions, I'll choose A. Well, that thing being of value creates the economic incentive to secure it. And that I like to tell people, first focus on the why, and that will inform the how. The how is the 0 to 1, mind-boggling. Humans are like, human ingenuity is like beyond like things that we can truly appreciate, because that there's a lot that goes into the how. And I tell people, just accept that there's a lot that goes into it, and if you focus on the why, that will inform your understanding of how. But that when people say Bitcoin is not backed by anything, like, they print $5 trillion, and the way that happens is literally a computer screen. People will say, when they say the dollar's backed by something, they'll say the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. They'll say, the IRS. They'll say, military guys with guns. And then I like to again respectfully point out that every fiat currency that's ever hyperinflated had a government that put its full faith and credit in it, that had a taxing authority, and that had a military with guns. That the government does not tax things, or that government taxation does not give things value. Governments tax things that are of value, and that in this world, Bitcoin is protected and secured by a number of key apparatuses that involve mining, that involve nodes validating all transactions ever by everyone. But there's this very important economic incentive, that Bitcoin is controlled by no one. It is fully decentralized. It gets more and more decentralized as more people adopt it as a standard, and that nobody has an incentive to let somebody else that they do not know print money. That everyone is pointing a gun at everybody else. And that, imagine there's 100 people and there's 99 of them all validating Bitcoin transactions and consuming real world energy as part of that security function. That one person that says, hey, pay me, 21 million and one, everybody else pointing the gun would say, I just shot you, you're dead. You don't exist in my world.
Yeah.
That's not a Bitcoin. And so that when people once they've answered the questions of the why it exists, and it says, now everybody in the world has an interest in securing that. And it's not that we all get together, it's that the economic incentives in the construction of the network make it impossible functionally to undermine it. But that inability to undermine it is also because the economic incentives are all aligned behind, I have an incentive to prevent everybody else from printing more money. And if I can't do it, nobody else can. And that's the economic incentive that the Bitcoin network as a whole enforces. So the best way to describe it is like a massive game of Mexican standoff. Another way to think about it is like everyone's pointing the gun at each other saying, no, you cannot print money. Or I don't have an economic incentive. And because the network is so large, it's not possible for people to collude to get together. That was attempted in 2017 and failed fantastically and miserably.
Beautifully.
And beautifully. And what that also did was it formed everyone about that fact that Bitcoin was sufficiently large to fend off beautifully, like not even a chance, not even a question. Maybe where like some miners got together and tried to change something, not about the supply, but about what's referred to as the block size.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it is now the Bitcoin network is 20 times as large, it's probably 30 times as large as that point. And the energy that's securing it is, 20 to 30x as well and more distributed. And so that game of people pointing guns at each other is getting larger and larger. There's more and more people pointing guns, which makes it harder and harder, and not in the physical sense, like, because I do fall on this line that like Bitcoin's not a weapon. I'm just using the analogy of thinking about it being more and more decentralized, that the more and more decentralized it is, the harder and harder it would be to collude or to aggregate the amount of energy that it might require to write an invalid transaction to the Bitcoin ledger.
Well, and like, so I bring this exactly what you're saying up whenever somebody starts talking about, well, one day the government will have enough energy or computing power to do it, or quantum computers, or whatever, black pill idea is floated. And what I've always pointed out is any technology that's developed will be disseminated. And so if you had really badass, way more powerful than ASICs that we have today available to you, the most profitable thing you could do would be go into mining Bitcoin, right? And that all that computing power doesn't come for free. Like you said, when you look at the size of the Bitcoin network, and I find this like one of the most encouraging things, as I've watched the evolution of this, is you have energy costs at an all-time high. You have Bitcoin not at an all-time low or anything, but a real low compared to the top of the market in this last cycle. And then you have the hash rate at like an all-time high. Like that only works, again, if Bitcoiners are figuring out how to get access to the most inexpensive energy possible. Co-location with energy production facilities, flare gas operations, all of these different things that they're doing to keep energy costs down. But it shows that I don't know that you could put together a scenario that would test it harder at this point. You could have came up with a scenario that would have tested it harder in 2014, but not in 2022.
Right. And I think that consistently happens as a function of time. That as the network gets larger, as it gets more decentralized, it is more resistant to exogenous forces or external attack. And I think the point that you appropriately raised there, which is because this all does come back to economic incentives, which is when people say that Bitcoin isn't backed by anything, and when people say, the 21 million, how do you know? You need to get down to that next level of how the security apparatus actually functions, and the economic incentive is part of it. But if the Bitcoin network is secured by, I'm not sure where it is today, but kind of estimated to be in the 18, 20 gigawatt range, again, not controlled by any single party, but 1 megawatts to 10 megawatts, a couple hundred megawatts, but it's distributed all over the world. If you think that Bitcoin is backed by nothing, go actually to a Bitcoin mine and listen to the Bitcoin miners. And when you hear that noise and you will see the energy infrastructure that is supporting it, then you say, well, I might not understand how this all fits together, but there's something, like these people are doing something, and that it's important to then ask that question. But then if you kind of pull it out and you say, hey, somebody might build a 200 megawatt Bitcoin mine, and that might cost the equivalent in today's dollars of $1 billion of purchasing power. And that might take the planning process, the execution, the getting online might take 2 years. So you're 2 years and the equivalent of $1 billion in the ground. And if you try to say, pay me more Bitcoin that are consistent with the 21 million supply cap, you get zero.
Yeah.
And if you mine Bitcoin and you secure the network and you contribute that power to securing the Bitcoin network, all you get paid in is Bitcoin. So you have sunk costs in the ground. If you try to deviate and award yourself more Bitcoin that would be consistent with 21 million, your investment is sunk and you get paid zero. And if you mine Bitcoin and secure the Bitcoin network, you only get paid in Bitcoin. So the thing that you are securing is the medium of exchange that you are paid in. So why in any rational world would someone invest those dollars and then undermine their investment? What people would typically say is like, oh, it would be a nation state. The U.S. government would do that. Well, the government needs money too. And if they aggregated all of that power, they too would find out that they have the economic incentive just to secure the Bitcoin network and to earn Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Because you can't fund the military. You can't fund a military. You can't staff the IRS. You can't do anything that you want to do as a government if you don't have a form of money that works, and that the economic principles that underpin and dictate what makes something a better or worse form of money, and that objective evaluation do not change. based on what the government does.
What do you say to the person that's like, but anybody can make another cryptocurrency just like Bitcoin? Like I can copy and paste code. I think you actually hit quite a bit of it right there, because without that security behind it, that makes, Bitcoin as a network is the most successful things measured by dollars humans have ever done inside a decade. We've never done anything as successful. But there is that thought, well, I can make Jack coin, you can make Parker coin, Hunters can make Hunters coin, who's here in our chat with us. What's the real difference there?
So I guess I'll start with, because I think you said a lot of your viewers might be on the commodity money gold train. I think it's very similar to fool's gold. Imagine I went and got a rock and painted it the color of gold. You as a gold holder understand that there's a difference between those two things. You're like, I'm not taking your fool's gold or your rock painted gold as gold. That's not gold. Very similar in Bitcoin. It's I own Bitcoin, validated by the Bitcoin network. You create fool's gold and try to sell me it as gold, or you try to say this is better than gold, and then you become a snake oil salesman. And so I think it's like anchoring to there. All other cryptocurrencies are like fool's gold, or they are like a rock painted gold trying to be passed off as Bitcoin. You also, though, I always anchor to this. You have to, and gold is a great example, because you have to understand that the world converges on a single form of money. That doesn't mean that it's 100% to zero. Doesn't mean that cigarettes might not be used or might be used in prison as a form of money, and that there's some like tail of things in certain local economies that might function better as money than the world's primary form of money that commands 99.9% of economic value. That's what we're talking about. But that if you accept that the world did converge on gold as a monetary standard, then the question is, why did that happen? And will it happen in the context of Bitcoin? And do I actually, and then in an individual circumstances, do I interact on a daily basis with more than one form of money? When I'm actually going to the store and buying groceries, going to the gas station, paying for power, going to a ball game, all these people are accepting one form of money in my local economy. Why? Is that by coincidence? And so without that grounding on the economic principles, you'll never get to the point of understanding why, if I create copy 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of Bitcoin, why they aren't Bitcoin, that the right analogy there is the fool's gold one. Now, if I come to Bitcoin and start at the first principles of Bitcoin, it is that the Bitcoin code base can be copied. It has been copied. The Bitcoin code base is open source. I could go copy the Bitcoin code base tomorrow and say that there will only ever be 21 million. Take my Parker coin. And you would look at it and you would say, hey, like, one, how do I know that there's only going to be 21 million? I'm just taking your word. And this key element is introduced of trust versus trustless. Bitcoin is decentralized. It is trustless. If I create copy B, now you're taking my word, because all of the properties that exist in Bitcoin, you can copy the code base, but you cannot copy the monetary properties. You cannot copy that 18 to 20 gigawatts of power that's increasing as a function of time. You can't copy all of the infrastructure that exists to secure Bitcoin, going from hardware wallets to multisig to the ability to help people buy and sell Bitcoin, to the Lightning Network, to people, investing in QR codes to make transactions easier. All of that infrastructure can't be copied and ported over. That requires human time and effort. And then you extend that out. Okay, if the difference is that you copy the code base, but the infrastructure doesn't exist, and you're creating a trusted system that is centralized versus a trustless system that is decentralized. And if money does one thing in terms of securing value into the future and then allowing you most efficiently to convert that back into real world goods and services, and you only need one, that thing is not just marginally inferior, it is absolutely inferior. It is inferior to the point of being rendered useless, because throughout that process you have the ability to opt into A, which is Bitcoin.
See, and we have I know this person. They're asking a legitimate question in their mind here. What Bitcoin started with a couple of computers, and I think there is a point where a thing takes over, and it's the thing you want. Yes, you could make another cryptocurrency. I could take open source software, WordPress, and open source plugin called BuddyPress, and I can make a clone of Facebook. I can roll that out tomorrow morning, and nobody will use it. Right? The decision's been made. Nobody's putting a Litecoin mining operation into a co-location facility at a wind farm with oil-cooled ASICs. You probably right now, this minute, could make some money, but nobody is doing it. Everybody that's going to go that far has already made this decision. This decision has been made. This momentum has happened. This network exists. And so now you're looking at it going, well, I'll make one with a bigger block size. I'll make 81 million instead of 21 million. I'll make 200 billion instead of no matter what, the block size will be larger. We'll use this other methodology to transfer so it'll be cheaper or whatever. It doesn't matter. This decision's been made at such a level that you now have this juggernaut that I just don't think, I don't care what you put out, it doesn't matter anymore. It's all that infrastructure is there. It's not moving.
Right. And I think that buried in there was the killer app is you have a form of money that can't be printed.
Correct.
Right. And that the best you can do, like that, one, that is the primary value proposition. And two, that the best anything else could do is match it. So on the thing that is most important, the very best you could do is get to an optimal state that just equates to it, that would be replicating. And when we think about technology adoption, you don't have one technology replace another by being just as good. Now, there's a reality that when you go down this rabbit hole, you will figure out that because Bitcoin already exists and has solved this problem of delivering to the world a form of money that can't be printed, that good B is always inferior because it can't replicate it because Bitcoin already exists. Now, a second thing, because I do think that this is important, which is that when Bitcoin was created in 2000, when basically the documentation was put out for it in October of 2008, and the network was lit up in 2009, that when there was one person in the network, it was centralized. When there was two people in the network, it was centralized. That Bitcoin's code base to this day is not money. It's just messages being passed back and forth on the internet and being enforced and those messages being written into a distributed, basically computers all over the world. You can think about it as a distributed computer, but it's really individual computers that are all validating other computers' transactions and messages that they're passing back and forth. But that Bitcoin wasn't money when it was launched. At some point in time, it became money. It became useful as a tool as money, and that once it achieves some level of consensus or some level of sufficient decentralization, that the core things that define what is and is not a Bitcoin couldn't be changed. And those are principally that there will only ever be 21 million, such that any Bitcoin that is being sent that is inconsistent with that supply schedule gets rejected by all nodes in the network, and that a Bitcoin that is spent can't be spent twice. So if I have a Bitcoin and I send it to you for your car and I send it to another guy for their car, that the Bitcoin network has a way to discern which one of those things happened first and only accept one of them as a valid Bitcoin transaction. The same analogy, particularly for gold people, is true of gold. Like imagine, go back, I don't really have my history of when gold started to truthfully emerge, but just imagine in a theoretical example, the first ounce of gold is taken from the ground. Gold is not money.
No, I was going to say this. Keep going. I was going to say exactly what you're about to say.
It is a shiny object. It might be something of value. It might have been converted into a tool, but then other people started recognizing that people valued this thing, and they started going to the earth and extracting gold or finding it in a mine. And then what happened as a consensus started to emerge that this thing was valuable, even if not understanding consciously or subconsciously what money was, then a monetary system started to be built. So it started with a single ore extracted from the ground, And then as it became valuable, a monetary system was built. That monetary system was vaults and settlement networks and technology to assay gold to determine whether or not it was actually the physical element of gold, transfer networks, coinage. As that monetary network was built, or all the infrastructure that allowed for a more efficient transaction in gold, that gold actually gained in value because it became a greater utility. Think about Bitcoin as ore in the ground, and with each piece of infrastructure, again, developing hardware wallets, building mines, building the Lightning Network, that is building the infrastructure that is turning raw ore into an actual utility. It's a very analogous or very parallel process. It's just happening a lot quicker because knowledge can distribute a lot quicker. And Bitcoin is superior from a monetary perspective in terms of its underlying properties that allow for far faster development of the network.
And we have a network today, or a series of networks today, that didn't exist at the time gold was created. But you were going exactly where I was thinking as you were talking your way into that, in that when gold was discovered, because some humans discovered this shiny metal, and it was a little different. It was kind of unique, and maybe they made a ring to stick in their nose or in their ear or whatever. And it did then take this path that you just described. But nobody created the gold foundation to market this idea. Hey, let's turn gold into money. Just like nobody really did that with Bitcoin. Bitcoin was very organic in the way it came out. The person or group of persons they created, as we call Satoshi Nakamoto, just went away. And this thing was there. And people today say, you were lucky to early in or whatever. Anybody could have mined it on a laptop in the beginning and have a huge stack today, but you didn't. But you could have. And that's the thing that I'm sure when gold first started to make its way out into the world as money, acquiring it, because gold, when as we discovered new lands that hadn't been prospected for gold, the first gold is easy gold. That's where this analogy really is very similar.
But it's also less valuable. The things
correct.
that you could potentially purchase, and I think that kind of in that same kind of train of thought, that kind of when we think about early people mining Bitcoin, it was like, but it wasn't the utility was so much lower. It wasn't of value, and that you had to be a special kind of interesting, weird, smart, visionary to be investing your own time and energy to doing that, because anybody that's held Bitcoin for several years and held it through rises and falls understands that holding Bitcoin psychologically is very difficult. It might have been easy to do that, but then to have the foresight to do it, that was not easy. And then, when Bitcoin went from 1 to 10 and back to 2, and then to 100 back to 20, and then to 1,000, if you're still holding Bitcoin, you had some like incredible vision and understanding of what was happening and foresight that very few people could possibly have. And then because you did that, what you afforded the rest of the world was a form of money that can't be printed. And so whatever they have to pay you to get that out of your cold dead hands, like you earned every bit of that because your willingness to store your value in that and to perform that security of a function for the Bitcoin network before it was popular to do so afforded everybody else who comes behind us the opportunity to benefit from sound money that can't be printed, that has a fixed supply, that can be transmitted over the internet. And I think that is a very important kind of part of that story.
Well, and so one thing that made it easy for me to adopt Bitcoin was that I was a person that believed in thermoeconomics, that it was really all about energy. So it was a perfect metaphor for me. But part of understanding that then is if inflation is more and more money chasing less and less goods, then a deflation currency is me, because I so value the energy that I'm holding, foregoing my consumption of goods and services, which makes actually more available. So the fact that I am unwilling to part with my stack of sats actually means that there's more of material goods and services for other people. That's partly why they cost less in that scenario, because I have a time preference that says it's worth holding on to this. So it's instead of hoarding, what it really is foregoing, because I could take my Bitcoin and I could go out and acquire a whole bunch of stuff. Well, that pulls that stuff off the market, if that makes sense.
Right. And I think that and I wrote an article called Bitcoin is the Great Definancialization that goes into this, which is, the Keynesians economists are like, just think any central banker or anyone who thinks that managing the money supply from central command is a good thing, they will say that hoarding is bad. And I start with saying that hoarding is just savings. And then we're getting into the question of what does savings means, and that, in the context of Bitcoin, I and in this article I articulate the world. Imagine that there's 21 million Bitcoin. They're all in circulation. Currently today, there's about 19 million, a little bit over that, and approximately 2 million yet to be mined over the course of the next 120-ish years. But imagine a world where they all exist. Nobody can save any more or less Bitcoin in aggregate at any point in time. And I don't know if it's a paradox. It seems like a paradox to me. But the fact that people cannot save in aggregate more Bitcoin, can't save more than 21 million, that actually creates the incentive to save. And that in that world, more people have an incentive to save, and all consumption is what you said, is foregoing. All savings is foregoing of consumption.
Yeah.
And by saving, you're actually creating more people in an economy that have the capacity to consume and to invest. And that, I think the right framework of what you were describing is that your decision to save is functionally telling the market that's not good enough.
Correct.
Like, bring me something better. If I have a finite and fixed share of the entire world's form of money, and I only got that because I delivered value to somebody else, I now get to decide who gets paid this finite unit of the currency. And that's a very consequential decision, that once I live in a world where my purchasing power is expected to increase, I look at every economic decision, not necessarily everyone, but like directionally every decision with a much closer eye, a sharper pen. But what I'm functionally doing is saying, hey, if you want this Bitcoin, or you want this denomination of Bitcoin, these sats, you haven't shown me something good enough. That's what my saving is. I mean, in part, it's me saying I'm going to need this in the future too. But I'm also communicating my time preference and evaluating whether I consume today or defer it to the future. If my purchasing power is going to increase, I'm more likely to defer it. But if someone brings a high quality good along, I'm more likely to consume, because we all have positive time preference. We all have to sustain ourselves. And that is something else that people miss. Imagine 21 million Bitcoin, and there's 7.5 billion people in the world that are all competing for the best form of money that's ever existed. And they all have to consume things every single day to sustain themselves. They need food. If they want to improve their condition, they need energy, they need power, they need clean water, they need healthcare. Not everyone needs 100% of those things every day, but if 7.5 billion people need to sustain themselves, they do have to consume every day, and they're all competing for a fixed resource to then allow themselves to build and accumulate more things that make their lives better on average. So I do think that fundamental savings mechanism, and that it is all about aligning all economic incentives across everybody who operates within the Bitcoin network.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that has always been an objection to a deflationary currency is the concept of money hoarding. And going back pre-Bitcoin, if I have a coin, I can only make so many pieces of this coin, right? And it can actually become a problem. While there's only 21 million Bitcoin, I believe there's 21 quadrillion Satoshis.
Yeah.
So we have a long way out before we have to worry about not having enough units. And I've had people say, well, doesn't that actually make it not capped? Well, it's totally capped. Like, if I do cut this coin into 100 million pieces, it still only goes back into one coin, right? So it's not making more.
I think that is one of the
pieces.
That's one of the strange things that it's kind of like boggling to the mind. It might come back to the thing we were talking about earlier, where it's like it's so simple that it like hurts people's brains. Where it's like, if you took a gold bar for a gold bug and you said, I carve it into 100 units, did I create more gold, or did I just spread it out to more people? It didn't actually change the scarcity dynamic. Another example would be like, imagine I have a pizza and I slice it into 100 slices rather than 6. Did I feed more people? No. But in the context, so it didn't change the scarcity, but in Bitcoins, because I can divide it into functionally a infinitesimal number of units, I can actually create billions of savers. I can ultimately create a world where a billion people can access this, or billions of people can access it, and that billions of people can transact. And so in that sense, it is feeding more people, but it's not actually creating more units of the currency. It's causing the purchasing power as more people adopt it to increase, but it's also allowing them a utility, which is storing value into time and being able to freely transact with people in their local economy or any economy in the world, truthfully. And that when people start to understand, because I think, one of the other, I think visualizations, or at least I'm a very visual person. It's like, imagine that fixed supply and it's just a flat line. And then imagine a city being like a physical city being built. All that's happening is the currency is going from person A to person B to person C to person D to facilitate trade. But the amount of money is remaining constant, and the actual things, the tools available to us are increasing. That is what quote deflation is. That is what purchasing power increasing means. It means that there's more economic goods in the marketplace, and you don't actually need more money to produce those things. You actually need a fixed and constant supply, or at least that would be the optimal state. And that and this is something that also I think is very fundamental and true, which is if your form of money is working, and by that, it is being used to produce more things, to facilitate more and more trade, and to make that trade more efficient and accessible to more people that can offer more goods to the market to trade, that if your currency is not increasing in purchasing power, you almost by definition have a bad form of money. Now, it can exist on a spectrum that if one form of money devalues, less fast than others, and it might still have been a better choice. So there isn't necessarily an absolute there. But if a form of money is working practically, fundamentally, functionally, what it means is that unit of currency is being traded, and we're creating more homes, we're creating more power, we're creating, we're delivering clean water to more people. We're creating more trading partners, and those trading partners can then turn around and deliver to the market more goods and services. And with a fixed supply, that very naturally translates into each unit of currency increasing in purchasing power rather than losing purchasing power, which most people would describe as inflation.
Gotcha. Let's talk a little bit about what the company you work for, Unchained, does, and a little bit about Bitcoin ETFs. So I actually want them to allow the existence of a Bitcoin ETF. I would tell somebody I don't think that you should use that to hold Bitcoin in unless you have money that's somehow captive and there's no other way that you can get exposure to it that way. I want to see this for the wall of money it unleashes. I want to see this for, you always get they're gonna get rid of Bitcoin. They're gonna get rid of Bitcoin. I think the day that Bitcoin is part of a teacher's pension and a firefighter's pension and a cop's pension, we can stop talking about that forever. We're done. That becomes it's like messing with an Indian reservation at that point. You're not going to do it. But what do you say as far as like people that want to hold Bitcoin, custodial versus non-custodial, and what options are there if they want to hold with using retirement money for it?
So one, everything is good for Bitcoin. So if an ETF gets created again, I think that's good for Bitcoin. I similar to you, I wouldn't recommend that people store their wealth in that ETF, but some people will, and a range of choice in the marketplace is not a bad thing. So I do believe that would be a good thing. I think that there is no one size fits all, but I do hold my Bitcoin in a certain way, and I recommend people evaluate the options and understand them to be able to make the best choice for them. I think that, the way that I look at it is, you can, well, one, I would step back and I'd say 19 million Bitcoin exists. All of those Bitcoin are controlled by keys, cryptographic keys. The best way to think about that is think about a key fob, or think about an iPhone. It's, key lives on a device, can live in other forms as well. But there's a device that secures a cryptographic key that is necessary to move any Bitcoin. But the principal thing being, to conceptualize this for people, is all 19 million Bitcoin are controlled by keys. Now, if you go to a Coinbase, that operates like a legacy bank. A lot of people think about it as Coinbase has your keys. Coinbase does not have your keys. They have their keys, and you have a deposit like you have at the bank, and you have to show up nicely to the door of Coinbase and knock on the door and say, sir, ma'am, can I please have my money? And at that point in time, they might decide not to give you your money. And that, a lot of people kind of think that at the same time that becomes an ideological principle, that people who hold their own keys, because the alternative is in Bitcoin, this is what our company does. We help people hold their own coins. We help people do that, or their own keys, I should say. We help people do that in a more secure way for a large universe of people, not for everybody, but for a large range of people. It makes holding keys more accessible, and it puts them in sovereign control of their Bitcoin in a way that a third party, including our institution, could not prevent them from moving Bitcoin. But it affords them a financial institution as a partner to share in the ownership of keys. So the way that our system works is when I talk about all 19 million Bitcoin being secured by keys, a Bitcoin or 0.1 Bitcoin or 10 Bitcoin can be secured by a single key, or that same atomic unit could be secured by multiple keys. Okay. In our world, there's 3 keys. Our clients have 2 keys and we have 1, and 2 out of 3 keys are required to transfer any Bitcoin. So we cannot move our clients' Bitcoin. We cannot prevent our clients from accessing or transferring their Bitcoin, but we're there as a partner to help them get set up. We hold one of the 3 keys such that if something happens with one of theirs or one of their backups, we can help them move funds, but importantly, we can't unilaterally do it. And we're there from a technical perspective as a security partner, should at any point in the future something come up, to be able to help them. So the important distinction is, if you're holding your keys to your Bitcoin, no institution or person can prevent you to access your money. And I think what people saw in Canada over the trucker rally, that without due process, people got locked out of their life savings. It doesn't necessarily even have to be one of those critical failures. It happens to be, do you want to put yourself in a position where somebody else could put you between you and your life savings, between the surplus of what you've delivered to other people and have not yet consumed of them? That is the value of holding keys at the most fundamental level. That what we do at Unchained is what we help individuals and businesses access. But then also there's an important principle baked in, which is not just if you're anchoring to the point of censorship, but it is that unless you are holding your own private keys, that the way that, say you're using a Coinbase, you're tethered, your Bitcoin and the way that you access your Bitcoin are tethered to the internet 24/7. You might access your Bitcoin or transfer your Bitcoin very, few points in time. But when you're sleeping, the same way that you would access your Bitcoin is an attacker. The most likely way that you might lose your Bitcoin is that someone hacks into your account and transfers Bitcoin out. That when you hold your own keys, it is functionally the only way to eliminate or sever the connection to the internet from how you hold your Bitcoin, and that is one of the greatest source of risks. And so you actually reduce your attack surface. You turn security of your Bitcoin from being in digital form to being in physical form, and it actually becomes easier, and you get the benefit of not allowing a financial institution, whether it's Unchained or any institution, to decide to prevent you from accessing your money. And then we can talk about it, but the question of your retirement, you can also hold, and we do help people do that. We help people hold an IRA in that same approach to Bitcoin custody. They get the benefit of Bitcoin, they get the benefit of being tax advantaged, and they hold 2 out of their 3 keys. So their money, I think, and I really think about it as like, it's one of the very few ways to have your retirement actually outside of the U.S. financial system.
And see, I think people really need to understand the beauty of multi-signature, which is what you're talking about. So if I had my key engraved on this set of fingernail clippers or whatever, and I had got as safe as I could storing on my property, a safe company comes out, cores a hole in the foundation and puts sleeves a floor safe in. And I dropped this down at the bottom of that, and it's down there. If somebody breaks in the house, the odds that a safe crack are good enough to get in there pretty low, but somebody could get their hands on it. Now they have it. Now they can get my Bitcoin. If I'm using a multi-sig and I have a second key stored in an independent place from that location, then they've got nothing. And if this goes away and I can't find it, as long as I have this and my link to Unchained or whoever the other party would be in a multi-sig, I still have access to my coin and my thief does not. And that's hard for people to understand because I never gave up control. I had 2 of 3 at all times, but I also had a redundancy. I had a 2 is 1, 1 is none, 3 is for me, as we say
right
all the time.
And that is also one of like the most fundamental perfections of Bitcoin as money versus gold, as an example. Like this idea of multisig. If you have a gold bar, it has to live in one physical location. And this is hard for people to generally understand, but once they start to get keys in their hand, they start to understand it better. It becomes more intuitive that you could have 1 Bitcoin. And when I say 1 Bitcoin, it could be 0.1 Bitcoin. Let's just use the 0.1 Bitcoin analogy because you could save $20 worth of Bitcoin. But let's just say 0.1 Bitcoin. That 0.1 Bitcoin could be secured by that 1 key, and then you have a single point of failure.
Correct.
Or that 0.1 Bitcoin could be controlled by multiple keys at the same time. And what that means is if you say have 3 keys that are securing it and 2 of those keys must be used to be able to create a valid Bitcoin transaction, then that Bitcoin does not live in any one place. It atomically does not live in a single unit. And so that if somebody breaks into a home and seizes a safe, your Bitcoin is not at risk. And that is not true if there's a gold bar in that safe. And that what we are in the process of doing through Unchained, other people in the Bitcoin network as well, we're perfecting the ways to increase the level of Bitcoin security because in a very similar way to gold, that there had to be people that built safes to put gold in, and then gold was more secure, right? This development of multisig is very similar, analogous to that process that, Bitcoin, if we talk about the value proposition of it, the finite supply, the fixed supply, the 21 million, that if you can store your wealth in a form of money that can't be printed, it's going to preserve its purchasing power more than something that gets printed easily. Well, if it was possible for you to lose that, then you can't benefit from that finite supply. And that multisig as an application, which is native to Bitcoin, but then what we help people do is make that easier to use. And then also have the benefit of a financial partner holding 1 of 3 keys. So you get that benefit of no man, woman, judge, jury can come between me and my money if I don't want them to. But also having the benefit of a partner there to help in those instances where we're not dealing with a scenario where you're being censored or being prevented from accessing something. That idea that 0.1 Bitcoin is actually being secured by multiple keys that exist in the physical world that aren't in the same location. And that have redundancies is a very, very core aspect to the security element that actually makes Bitcoin a superior form of money, that it's actually easier to secure at lower cost and in a way that doesn't have a single point of failure.
So I had a word in my notes for discussion with you, asymmetric, because you love that word. You use it all the time. We both use it in regard to Bitcoin in a couple different ways, honestly. I saved it till after this, though, because over the years in doing this, you develop influence. And you start to be very careful with your words. And when you start talking about putting your retirement account into Bitcoin, when Bitcoin's at $69,000, and you realize somebody might have 500 grand sitting in an IRA and might roll the whole thing because one dude on a podcast says, you get pretty cautious with this. And I say over and over, like, come into it, average across time. But I think right now, sitting with the network larger than it's ever been, having been attacked every 6 way from Sundays, and sitting at $18,000, $19,000. I'll get on Twitter and Bitcoin crashed. And I get all excited to go buy it. And it's like 19.1. I'm like, this is the class of 2021. They don't know anything about a crash yet, really. But from here, this seems like a very asymmetrical trade. How asymmetrical do you think it is now compared to when it was $300?
The way I would describe it is, first, there's a saying in Bitcoin, which is verify, don't trust. So I always anchor to that point, which is that if you want to be able to weather all storms, if you want to be able to potentially convert your Bitcoin, your retirement, funds into Bitcoin at 69,000 and not lose an ounce of sleep when Bitcoin quote crashes to 20,000, that is possible, but only if you've done your own work. And I think people starting to understand and listening to this podcast will hopefully be additive to each person who listens to its knowledge base. But understanding Bitcoin, understanding the fixed supply, understanding why people will have to adopt it into the future, or why they would adopt it, why that thing is of value. It's like I always anchor that fundamental because retirement money is very, very important. Now, I can just explain from my own kind of thought process. I'll talk about asymmetry in general. I'll talk about what I've done myself, and then I'll talk about like where we are today, which I think is the hardest thing to predict. I know what will happen in the long term, but I view Bitcoin as the greatest asymmetry that's ever existed, and that doesn't matter if Bitcoin's at 69K or 20K. I describe it as the greatest asymmetry that's ever existed. And when I talk about asymmetry, typically asymmetry might be a word that venture capital investors might use, where they make 10 investments, they might expect 9 out of 10 to fail, but the one investment that succeeds is increases in purchasing power by 1,000x, and that one thing had 100% downside, but it had the opportunity to have 1,000x upside, if not more. That is what I'm talking about in terms of asymmetry. Now, if I think about asymmetry in the context of Bitcoin, and why I would describe it as the greatest asymmetry that's ever existed, is that the world is adopting a new form of money. I would probably estimate that a maximum of 10 million people have any material exposure to Bitcoin, and I would describe materiality as materiality to you, somewhere between 5 to 10%. Like, how many people in the world have 5 to 10% of their savings in Bitcoin? It's not more than 10 million people. I mean, that's based on my own research, my own estimates, and again, verify, don't trust. But that 7.5 billion people are going to adopt Bitcoin, in my view, because it is a fixed supply currency, because everybody in the world would benefit from a form of money that can't be printed, because it will get more and more secure and more decentralized and greater utility from here as more people adopt it. That is what asymmetry is. If you just understand that it is very binary, and it's like, and I don't believe this to be true, but if you understood, well, it could be 100% down, could lose everything, or it could be we're going to go from a world where 10 million people have Bitcoin to 7.5 billion, and Warren Buffett has 0 Bitcoin, and Google has 0 Bitcoin, and Apple has 0 Bitcoin, and everybody needs money, and like every company in the world and every billionaire in the world is going to need Bitcoin. That is inherently asymmetric. Now, in my view of thinking about it as the greatest asymmetry in the world, it is not just that, because most asymmetric opportunities or events are low probability. I also view Bitcoin as not just probable, but increasingly inevitable, because of where it's at, where it stood the test of time, and the attacks it's survived and strengthened through those. That most asymmetric events are low probability. Bitcoin has the greatest positive asymmetry that's ever existed, because what it represents is the world adopting a new form of money, and money exists at the foundation of the economic layer. Everything drives off of money working in our modern world. But when you add into that it being probable and then increasingly inevitable, that adds to the asymmetry of it. But there's a third component, which is if you're holding a form of money that fails, you have inherent negative asymmetry of that. And everything that is levered to that economic system, that is levered to that base form of money, that it's like, I like to describe it as the game of hide and seek, where the kid is in the corner and he covers his eyes. Everyone can see the kid, but the kid doesn't know it. That this equation is, you don't have to adopt Bitcoin, but money is a consensus, just as gold emerges money, that you can't just look away, because if you decide not to play and everybody else decides to, you're going to get dragged along. And if you hold a form of money, imagine if you were holding the Venezuelan bolivar when it went to 0. That is what negative asymmetry is.
Sure.
So it's positive asymmetry with the probability versus low probability versus the risk that you're wrong and you don't play and you hold the form of money that doesn't just get debased, but that is no longer accepted, that is inherently negatively asymmetric. That is how I frame Bitcoin in whole being the greatest asymmetry that's ever existed. And that's why, to me, it doesn't matter if Bitcoin's 69K or 20K. Now, when I come to the question of retirement, and I did this myself back in 2020, I moved out of the last semblance of what I had in the legacy financial system was in treasuries, and I converted it to Bitcoin. I did that at a point in time. People can do it in points in time. I think that the framework that I have for it was this money that's in my IRA, I'm going to be saving for it for the long term, for 30 years, 35 years plus. Bitcoin is a long game. And it is attractive for that reason. It was attractive to me at least. And that it's like for savings in that way, but you have to be able to have a long view of Bitcoin. And if you have that long view of Bitcoin, then using long-term savings matches up very well for it. But in my own case, and I do think this is the proper framework, it's like over the 30-year period, if you think about negative asymmetry, I don't try to predict when the dollar is going to go away, but I know as a moral certainty that they're going to print trillions more and that everything levered to that system is going to be disrupted. I also have a framework as to why people are going to adopt Bitcoin. That in that world, I viewed it as the second I got my money out of the legacy financial system, there was this massive calming that I was like, this decision is going to ensure that any other decision that I make from here is going to be secured. But I also came at that perspective from a very grounded understanding in Bitcoin. And I think that people have to match, especially when they're using retirement savings, it does match well because of the long-term nature of the savings and will smooth out this volatility. But you also have to be anchored in some reality or objectivity around why you're doing what you're doing. But we do help people do that on chain. We do have an IRA and we do have it in that world where it's not just in Bitcoin, right? It's Bitcoin, but when you hold your own keys. So yes. When I think about it being actually outside the US financial system, it is because I'm actually holding my own keys. And that is what we enable for people. It's Bitcoin denominated, but it's not, dollar denominated exposure to Bitcoin. It's actually the physical Bitcoin. It's like gold in your safe, but Bitcoin controlled by multiple keys. You control the majority of the keys. You control the controlling quorum in order to spend it, and you're securing it for the long term. And so when people work with us, they just work with us as a firm. I think it is a highly consequential decision that people have to take seriously. But I also think, in my view, it is like the optimal way I could possibly save for my retirement. But each individual has to make that decision on their own.
I agree, and I tend to also add with the asymmetric thing. And you said Bitcoin's not a weapon, but I think it can be. It can be compared to one because money is power and power can be a weapon. And to me, it is the first ever, and I guess this is an analogy because it's not necessarily a weapon, but the first ever asymmetrical weapon of war. The concept of asymmetrical warfare is ancient. It goes back to the art of war before that. But that's kind of the first place it was really canonized. But an asymmetrical weapon is a totally different animal. And what I mean by that is, let's say we had the most peaceful little settlement on the planet, but no one owned a gun. And we went from our 0 to 1 wasn't to a matchlock. It was to fully automatic AKs. And so you and me and 1,000 other people had AK-47s in our little camp. And we were just very benevolent. We're not going to go out and hurt anybody. But all of a sudden, when we're attacked, you pop 1 or 2 people. They figure it out and go, no, don't bother these people anymore. What would ruin that for us is that technology getting into the hands of, let's call them our enemies or our adversaries, because now we would go back to a symmetrical form of war. We both have the same weapon. To me, for the first time in history with Bitcoin, we have a thing. If an adversary adopts it, you benefit. It doesn't matter who, every single person, entity, whoever. People are like, well, what if the Federal Reserve starts putting on the balance sheet? Please. That'll just get to the world you and I want faster. Like
right.
What if they hoard, half the supply? Fine. Make a Satoshi worth $1. See if I cry. Right? Like there is no downside in any entity, any group, any people adopting it if you're already in the game. Now, if you're not in the game, maybe that's not as true. But if you're in the game, then every single person that makes one tweak and makes the Lightning Network a little better for everybody. And I've never seen anything I've studied it and I've tried to find a thing that worked like that, where everybody benefited when anybody adopted it. I've never seen anything else in society. And that's why I think we'll have this tipping point. And I want to mention for you at the end here, for those who might be new to you, one of the things you're really known for is a series of articles kind of under the framework of gradually then suddenly. And I have a link in the show notes for everybody to check out. I really think you should read it if you want a deeper understanding of Bitcoin. But I think this is kind of how we get there. And I think if you would have told somebody 10 years ago we'd be where we are with Bitcoin, they would have said you were crazy. But when you show them where they are, they will say, well, if you were that good, you should be further. And I think that is kind of that gradually then suddenly thing. Like, it will be one big moment where it happens almost overnight, but it really might be a couple decades of build up to it.
Yeah, and that framework, I think that, with my series is kind of, I think the way that people come to learn, it was not parroted, but kind of off of the Hemingway saying of first slowly, then all at once. And he was describing the process of going bankrupt, and then it was kind of morphed into gradually then suddenly over time. But that the way that people go bankrupt is gradually then suddenly. It happened back in history, and then you find it out at a point in time. The way that currencies hyperinflate, degrades, and then like everyone figures it out, confidence is broken, can't ever come back from that. And it's very similar to how people understand Bitcoin on an individual level, that it's kind of like inching towards it, and then some idea connects, and it's like, whoa, like I think I just saw it for a fleeting moment, like how this could be possible. And then ultimately that will happen on a society-wide level. It's impossible to predict exactly when the consensus becomes so large, and the critical mass is that everybody else hits the single door exit to the movie theater at the same time. But that, in my view, is an inevitability. And I do think that the point that you raised about the fact that every single person that adopts Bitcoin actually makes Bitcoin more valuable. And the way I think about it is, not only is it somebody else to deliver goods and services, because when someone decides I'm going to start saving in Bitcoin, they are on the journey to saying, I will accept Bitcoin for my goods and services. First, someone has to understand why Bitcoin, there's a lot of speculation in Bitcoin. There's a lot of people who have Bitcoin that don't understand it. All of those things can be consistent at the same time, or not mutually exclusive. But that on the path to selling your goods and services directly for Bitcoin, it could be the cattle rancher, it could be the oil and gas guy, it could be the auto manufacturer. And on that journey, you first have to understand why Bitcoin would store value into the future. Once you do, and you start purchasing it, converting fiat for it, what you are actually becoming is a trading partner for the network. Some people decide to build on Bitcoin. Sometimes some people decide to write about Bitcoin. Some people decide to deliver value, but everyone who's saving in Bitcoin is delivering value to the Bitcoin network, and what they represent is trading partners. So if the context of the Fed, I don't think the Fed produces much value, so it's going to be hard for them to accumulate a ton of Bitcoin. But if the Fed adopts Bitcoin, great. The BOJ is going to have to act next. The ECB or whatever it breaks up into when the Euro project actually fails, probably in a final way. But then the same is true of Apple and Google. Like if you want iPhones, eventually Apple is going to say, hey, if you want my iPhone that required all this work, and maybe you don't, maybe you want a dumb phone, that has less technology in it, whatever it is, that eventually that person producing that good is going to say, pay me in Bitcoin. That person that adopts it is on that journey. And if I think it was an article I wrote called "Bitcoin Obsoletes All Other Money," that when you start to understand, I don't know which law it is, but each individual, imagine there's 1 million people in the Bitcoin network, and one person joins the Bitcoin network. The amount of trading partners just increased by 1 million. Everybody in that network
has one new partner.
And then when you think about that, each person is not just creating a one-to-one expansion of the utility, it's a one-to-many relationship. And that also kind of in that universe, that as Bitcoin becomes more valuable, as more people accept it, as more people adopt it, as the fixed supply gets spread out and more and more people, that what it represents is being able to take the same nominal unit of currency that represents more value that's transferred over the internet, and that kind of function of adoption actually adds to its utility too. So it is like money is very unique in that regard, but it's also very logical as to why that incremental adoption increases, and also increasing at a rate of multiples, if not orders of magnitude. And also when you think about it, imagine, because you also made this point, imagine the first 100,000 people to adopt Bitcoin. They had to be a certain type of, genius / crazy / weird
Pioneer, right?
pioneer.
To be willing to get shot in the back, like
yeah. And now a lot of those people probably don't still have Bitcoin. They might have sold it when it went to $1 or $10. But then imagine the next 100,000, more to the point. Those 100,000, those people were still probably weird, or genius or pioneers. Then think about the first million. Like starting to you've got to start to get outside of the truly, pioneering crowd. Like when you get to 1 million people, well, now imagine the next million. The next million are less than that first million. That it's easier for the next million to adopt Bitcoin once the first million have already gone before them. The consensus is starting to form. Now the next 10 million. Well, the next 10 million are easier than the first 10 million because the consensus is more obvious. There's more infrastructure. There's more trading partners. So it's not just that the network itself is a greater utility as there's more infrastructure, that with each new trading partner, Bitcoin actually becomes a greater utility. It's that with each next wave, the consensus is more and more clear. It's actually mentally easier to arrive at Bitcoin and easier to understand it as money as the network grows. Because that next 10 million, the next 100 million, the next 100 million after that, they're actively in a much functionally easier place to arrive at Bitcoin as a consensus of money because of all those people that went before them. And partly it's because there's more, authorship. My series called Gradually and Suddenly, the Bitcoin Standard, Inventing Bitcoin, Mastering Bitcoin, all that knowledge base is growing. But it's also, I'm looking at my peers. Hey, 10 people that I kind of respect and that I don't view as, living on the corner of an internet. They're saying that there's something here in Bitcoin. It might be Jack Dorsey. It might be Paul Tudor Jones. It might be somebody that exists in whatever corner of the globe you pay attention to as signal. As soon as a few of those people arrive at this consensus, you might be like, okay, this feels like magic internet money to me, but two people that I really respect are saying very rational things, and I know them to be rational, and I view them to be high signal. That's why it's easier for you to then adopt. And then that just, existing on a spectrum becomes easier and easier, because then there's 2 people in your circle, then there's 3 people, then there's 4 people. And you're like, man, I'm starting to be the one out of consensus. I need to take a look at this.
Yeah. And I mean, I kind of look at if you look at the cycles we went from geeks arguing about Bitcoin to nerds arguing about Bitcoin to podcasters and influencers arguing about Bitcoin to millionaires arguing about Bitcoin to billionaires arguing about Bitcoin to heads of state arguing about Bitcoin. That's kind of how I see the halving cycles now up to this point. And what's the inevitability of what comes next? And that leads into, you've been here a long time. I so appreciate you giving this. I didn't expect it. So thank you. But kind of with that thought, and one question from the audience, if you could give us the time for that. K-Bonk says, what do you think the 3 tipping points are for Bitcoin as a world reserve currency? What puts us over the finish line?
So I was going to say one last thing on that point, that, because as you were describing that process of kind of the scale of people who argue about Bitcoin and it's getting mind share by more and more people. It's also why Bitcoin is so asymmetric, which is 2 billionaires thinking about Jack Dorsey and Warren Buffett. One person can see it, one person can't see it at all, but each individual has the opportunity to beat Warren Buffett to the greatest asymmetry, right? And that Bitcoin is not an IQ test. It is a common sense test. It is, does money grow on trees or does it not? Is there such thing as a free lunch or is there not? A versus B, what are the differences between these 2 things, the dollar and Bitcoin or gold and Bitcoin? In terms of tipping points, I think that it is very difficult to predict timing. I prefer to anchor in first principles and things that I can beat to a drum in terms of questioning first principles, and then having those anchor points to then come back to question the world as it evolves and is particularly volatile, to say, are these things that inform my past decisions still true? And are they objective? And am I rationalizing my logic? Am I putting kind of flags in the ground and then moving them, or am I being consistent? I think that ultimately these two systems are dynamic. I won't completely hedge, so I'll give some kind of like tangible, but I want to qualify it before I do. These two systems are dynamic. If I'm choosing to store my energy and time and value in Bitcoin, I'm decidingly making that point not to store it in dollars. When I'm building Bitcoin, when I'm building Unchained, and when I'm helping people hold their own keys, I am actively, and everybody here at our company is actively contributing energy into infrastructure for Bitcoin. We are not doing that for the dollar system. And because when I decide to store my value in currency A, not in currency B, energy is moving over to network A, and it's actually leaving network B. So, and I think that's a perfectly good thing. Sometimes some people would say, Bitcoin's attacking the dollar. It's like, no, Bitcoin is providing us all a lifeboat, and people are going to benefit from it depending on when they adopt it and how much they defer consumption. But that kind of in that world, if that is true, think about a developer at Google or Microsoft leaving Google and Microsoft to work on Bitcoin. Yeah. It's taking energy out of those companies and conveying it onto the Bitcoin network, and it's conveying it in the form of new infrastructure that makes it easier to secure Bitcoin or transact in Bitcoin. My point is those two systems are dynamic. So when I think about this, it is how long can the legacy system survive? I think that it needs to be evaluated both independently as well as relative to Bitcoin, because every time that the Fed has to return on the printing press and print trillions of dollars, that causes people to learn about Bitcoin. Everything the Bitcoiners were saying turns out to be true. And look how much easier it is now to secure Bitcoin, buy Bitcoin, transact in Bitcoin. I'm going to take my dollars and sell more dollars for a smaller unit of Bitcoin because it's going to store value from that point in time more probabilistically or more functionally better than the dollar. So because of that, I get to this point that as more people exit the legacy system, that legacy system weakens, but it also weakens because they are actively printing money, which is the whole value proposition that Bitcoin is solving. I think that it's very difficult to believe that the dollar could again, it's going to sound crazy to certain people, but I'll explain my thought process, that the dollar exists in its current form in 10 years. Now, somebody might come up with a harebrained idea of, having a Bitcoin-backed dollar, but that wouldn't be the current form. Yeah. And the reason why I get there is, I think, again, it is difficult to measure because the Bitcoin network is a closed loop system. There are no identities. There are no, the Bitcoin network only knows what a Bitcoin is and isn't, and that there will only ever be 21 million, and how Bitcoin are issued and how currency is validated. But if I was to estimate the number of people that have Bitcoin today, it's, again, without finality, and do your own research, verify, don't trust. Sure. It would be difficult to imagine that it's more than 10 million people, but that it's somewhere around there. And that holistically in adoption cycles, and we can see this based on ultimately value, the Bitcoin typically rises by an order of magnitude in those adoption waves, which I think translates most back to adoption increasing by 10x. And then I think forward to say, if we go through two more adoption waves between now and the next 10 years, during a period of time that I know, just as I knew in 2016 that the Fed was going to have to print more money when they started to unwind post-financial crisis QE, they're going to have to do that again, and more people are going to figure out Bitcoin because knowledge distributes as a function of time. Over two adoption waves, if Bitcoin, that would mean that Bitcoin got to 1 billion people in the next 10 years. And knowing that it is definitionally easier for more people to adopt Bitcoin going forward than the first 10 million, not just because the infrastructure, because the knowledge exists, but because those 10 million went before them. That if we get to 1 billion people, and if that 100x increase translated just to an 100x increase in the value of Bitcoin, then because you're distributing the same unit of currency over 100x more people. And realistically, those are going to be the wealthiest people in the world, the Apples of the world, the Googles of the world, the nation states of the world, the Warren Buffetts of the world. That if you 100x the value of Bitcoin, then Bitcoin as a monetary system would be bigger than the dollar is today. And that they would be printing more money, but that functionally, once Bitcoin becomes larger than the dollar system or the euro system or the yen system, and the dollar system is the largest, that when in a steady state, not that it trades there at a point in time, but that it could retain that value, that's when the dollar is volatile and Bitcoin becomes the stable unit of account. So I put the time frame around 10 years, but again, I say I live to survive all weathers. People cannot get overexposed to something that they don't understand. My knowledge of Bitcoin and my planning for the future, I always plan to have enough dollars around so that I never need to sell my Bitcoin, but that I can survive all volatility. But part of that tolerance of volatility is a deep knowledge and understanding of Bitcoin at a technical level as well as a monetary economic level. Now, not everyone needs to have my technical level of understanding, but they also might not have the same exposure that I do as a result of that. And they don't need to have the technical understanding of Bitcoin, just like they don't need to have the technical understanding of the phone. This will be true. So I do think it is a verify, don't trust. You need to know enough to ask the questions of yourself to form your own framework. But people are not going to have to understand Bitcoin like the first 10 million did. Bitcoin just works. And it's going to work like when you pick up the telephone and talk to someone halfway around the world and you don't understand how that happened. People will be observing in the marketplace currency A losing value relative to all other currencies and goods and services, and currency B, Bitcoin, holding its value, increasing in purchasing power, and that knowledge distribution only accelerates. And that's why kind of thinking about how Bitcoin's been adopted historically in waves, and then kind of looking forward to the next 10 years and saying, will 1 billion people have Bitcoin in the next 10 years? I think that is probabilistic. And if that is true, then the dynamic of the dollar continuing to exist, if each one of those people is opting out of the legacy system, causes a new system to emerge as the primary method of commerce.
So I agree with you on not knowing time. I like the 10-year number. And the reason I like the 10-year number, about halfway through a halving. So 10 years is the completion of this halving cycle, the full 4 years, and the completion of 2 more.
Right.
And if you look at historically, that translates out on track with what you're saying. But I can't do timelines, and I never try to. When K-Bonko asked you for 3 tipping points, if I have to come up with like not when, but what to see, I said earlier, I think one would be the ability of Bitcoin to exist in a form where it goes into pension accounts. I think the second that happens, it's a massive wall of money. It's also a major lockup of available supply. It's a huge supply shock, right? I think the next thing from there, you hit it a bunch of times through your statement, is one major company adopts Bitcoin in a significant way. And people would say, well, MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy is not, and Michael Saylor would agree, I think, is not what I mean when I say major corporation, an Apple, a Google, somebody like that. Starts to put it on the balance sheet, starts to integrate it into their product set, et cetera. And then your last tipping point is any major nation. And El Salvador or Central African Republic's not a major nation. I think the state of Florida has got 3 times the population and 100 times the money of an El Salvador. Florida adopting Bitcoin would do more for Bitcoin than El Salvador would. So some nation of significant size, so a nation state the size of a Texas, a California, a Florida, a New York adopts Bitcoin, and then what happens is in each of those, the other parties must engage. So pension funds start to really, and I mean actual pension funds, not some weird thing you can do with Fidelity or the awesome products that you guys are opening up, but where it goes mainstream, then pension funds have to start competing with each other. One major corporation does it, the other corporations have to compete with each other. One major nation state does it, the other banks, the other nations have to compete with it. And those 3 things, and I could be totally wrong, like you said, verify, don't trust. But if I have to pick concrete things, those are the things I can see that possibly make this happen.
Yeah, and I would say to kind of get to that point. One, I think that it probably happens when 5 to 10% of the world,
Yeah.
or at least kind of wallet share or wealth, forms that consensus. Because it's not just the individual person, even though that's a key part of it. It's like, hey, are they Apple or are they, somebody with, $1,000 taking? Those two things are not created equal
Yeah.
when it comes to storing wealth in the Bitcoin network. I would say that it's interesting. I would say a few different things. I do think a like G7
Yeah.
country adopting it. I also think that a G7 current country that is not China banning it, like a Western country coming out and being like, "Oh no, this Bitcoin thing, we can't allow it," because that's the fait accompli. Like everyone says, like, "What couldn't Bitcoin just be banned?" And when you start to understand, well, hey, gold was banned, but gold didn't cease to be of value to the world. Bitcoin's harder to stop. And if the
It's harder to stop
country,
than drugs.
if a country, yeah, absolutely, and it's a greater utility.
Yeah.
And so, but if a country came out and said, "Oh shit, this thing, like we're losing control," that to me is the fait accompli. It's the admittance of like it's done. So on either side of those two things, I think it exists. And then
You've
the other
admitted
thing that
you can't win, right? That's
right,
what you've done.
and you can't say this thing Bitcoin is not money. At the same time, you say like we have to ban it because it's threatening our global hegemony.
Yeah.
Or at least within our four walls hegemony and
Yeah.
monopoly. Like it can't be those two things, and that's the signal it's sent. If they were ever to ban it, Safe has a great quote that is, if your country ever wants to ban something, you should probably want to own that.
Yeah.
But then the other thing would be, and it's not that I disagree with yours, but the tipping points is like when it becomes clear and obvious that the energy industry has figured out that Bitcoin can solve a problem for either
Stranded energy.
the capturing of stranded energy or the stabilization of grids and how grids are conceived and kind of matching supply and demand, which is an inherently complex and persistent problem. When the energy industry pivots full into Bitcoin, that too will be the tipping point.
Yeah, I want to revise my list now. I want to put that one on my list. I don't know which one I want to take off, but I think you're right because that affects seriously everything everywhere in the world because everybody uses energy. I think that's a better one than I'm not sure which one, but one of them has to come off the list. Dude, thank you. This has been great. I want people to know I have links to your Twitter, Unchained Capital's Twitter, Unchained Capital's website, your series of articles, which I think everybody should read. I believe Guy Swan put most of them in audio. So if you want to consume an audio, I think you can find them on Bitcoin Audible as well. Thank you so much. You gave me 2 hours, man. I sincerely appreciate it. You sound a little stuffed up. Maybe you're working through a cold or the COVID or something. So thanks for hanging in there for us, man. It was great.
Just a little Austin, Texas allergies. These 2 weeks,
Mountain
first couple of weeks of October, it gets me every year. But yeah, no, appreciate you having me on. I know we missed the first time, but I was really excited to come back on. And yeah, people can find us at unchained.com if they're interested in learning about what it is we do. If they go to that URL, unchained.com, they can schedule a consultation. We'll talk with a member of our team. If they're interested in the IRA and understanding the benefits, they can talk to one of the members of our team live. So recommend that people do that. And then, yeah, I'm on Twitter. It's in the show notes. A series Gradually Then Suddenly. Love sharing the knowledge base about Bitcoin. So appreciate you having me on, Jack. And anytime you want me, I'll be here.
I appreciate it. Down there in the link of the video for those watching live, when the audio goes up, that link will go to the audio result. If you click on it this minute, it won't go anywhere because we're not quite done yet. It should go up about an hour from right now. This if you're watching live. Parker, again, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Jack.